Ray Wheatley for Fightnews. I'm here with boxing legend and Hall of Famer, Colonel Bob Sheridan. How are you, Colonel?
Great, Ray. Always great to be with my best mate in Australia.
Good on you, Colonel. Colonel, like you've done some of the biggest fights of all time. The Thrilla in Manila, the Rumble in the Jungle. Just tell us a bit about the background on the Rumble in the Jungle.
That was an extraordinary fight. Of course, I was in a great position as a young broadcaster because I started so young in Miami, and I was with the Angelo and Chris Dundee, who was the promoter for Muhammad Ali in those years. So I was around all of those terrific fighters that they had in Miami. You know, guys like Willie Pastrano and fighters of that caliber that were fighting down in Miami, and to be around Muhammad Ali was just extraordinary. And then to go to Zaire and fight in it was a different time in history. Going to Africa was like going to the moon in those days. It was the first time that 4 satellites were used. There were only 4 communication satellites at that time that were used simultaneously, and that telecast went to 1 billion people live. It was one of the big promotions with involving Don King's first really big promotion that he was involved with. So it was an extraordinary place to be in, an extraordinary time, and a huge thrill for me to have called that fight. And I had no idea at the time. You know, here we are, 40 years later, and it's still a legendary fight. And then on the heels of that, the following summer, we went over to Manila and had the Thrilla in Manila with Joe Frazier, and that's a fight that you couldn't forget, with the heat and whatnot at Araneta in the Philippines. And Joe and Muhammad almost killed each other in that fight. It was unbelievable.
And a lot of people class that as the greatest heavyweight battle of all time, but you think maybe Larry Holmes and Kenny Norton?
You know, Ray, you're so astute, because that fight, because of the magnitude of the fight, as I'm talking about Manila now, between Frazier and Ali, was so great because of the magnitude of the 2 fighters involved. And Ali had just won the title back, and it was the 3rd fight in the trilogy between Joe and Muhammad, who will, for infamy in boxing, will always be connected because of those 3 fights. And you're right, they were both past their peak, but at the exact same area in their physical abilities. And like I said, they almost killed each other. So the fight was sensational because they were both the same ability at the same time. But the fight you mentioned, when Larry Holmes fought Ken Norton, both were in the peak of their careers, and it came down in those times. It was 15 rounds for the championship of the world, and it was this close, folks, this close, that fight, and Larry just barely eked it out in the final round and won the championship over Kenny Norton, and then held the title for many years. I think Larry Holmes, because he came on the heels of Muhammad Ali, one of the most underrated heavyweights of all time. I consider him one of the very best heavyweights of all time. Larry Holmes was a great fighter.
Now, another great fight that you've done. You suffered a heart attack the night before, the Tyson-Holyfield rematch. Well, you went ahead and called the fight after suffering a major heart attack the night before.
Well, of course, that fight was the ear-biting fight, and forever in boxing history, that'll be remain the ear-biting fight. But for me, because of the heart attack the night before, I'll never forget that fight, and that's for sure. After the fight and the ear-biting incident, I ended up back in the hospital. But the fight itself was a very frustrating thing that nobody talks about. That, you know, Evander knew every trick in the trade. He knew how to upset Tyson. He used his elbows, his head. He was a rough, tough fighter, and people didn't realize that about Evander, because outside the ring he was such a sweetheart of a guy. And Mike in those days didn't carry himself like the sweetheart of a guy that he truly is today.
Right.
He was a rough, tough guy, Mike Tyson. He was very intimidating. And Mike snapped. The guy hit him and cut Mike. He had trained so hard for that fight, and he cut Mike. And Mike just lost his cool and bit the ear, and we all know the history from there on. But one thing that I'm very pleased that both guys are okay in this day and age, and Mike Tyson has turned his life around completely, and is a very dear friend of mine, as is Evander, but I'm closer to Mike Tyson. But I'm really glad that Mike's doing so well today.
Yeah. Thanks very much for your time, Colonel, and best of luck for the future.
Thanks very much, Ray.
Cheers, Colonel.